Our mission is supporting women's health, happiness, and pursuit of fearlessness. They are the three pillars and the three lenses, if you will, that we put it's a filter. You put all of your content and decisions through that.
Which is really helpful to have.
Yeah, it's like you've got to have a blueprint. You absolutely have to have a blueprint. It's why you have a personal brand. It's why you have a brand for your actual business.
Well, I'm so glad to have everyone having a little backseat to listening in on this conversation today, where we're going to explore amplifying women's voices. And I'm joined by the talented Jo Stanley, who launched Broad Radio, which was Australia's first radio network for women and a platform that amplifies the full diversity of women's voices. That was on the back of her 20-year career in radio. So one of the angles that we're going to explore in this conversation is around the importance of understanding your audience. And I would argue, Jo, that your unique blend of really warm and honest content is made for this moment and something that we desperately need. So I'm really glad to have you joining us today.
It's a joy to speak with you, and I must say, on this adventure of being a startup founder, which was not what I predicted for my late 40s, early 50s, one of the great joys is meeting people such as yourself, which I would not have done if I'd stayed full-time in radio as a, radio host, as a broadcaster.
Yeah.
How wonderful.
Yeah, in a very intense, but as you said, like we can all fall into being in our own little bubbles, can't we?
Yes, most definitely. I actually deliberately, at the age of 48, I thought to myself, do you know what? I've got such a very, God bless them, love my friends, but they're very, small group, and I need more diversity, and I need to be challenged. I need new ideas. I need different kinds of people. And so here I am 5 years later, just going, oh, I really did deliver on what I imagined for myself.
That's a beautiful thing. I love that. And we'll definitely pick up on that, I think, in the conversation today, because it's being deliberate about that is really important, I think, and definitely something we can dig into a little bit more. For those that don't know you, I'm just going to give a little bit more of your background. So Jo is one of Australia's most successful radio hosts with 2 record-breaking #1 breakfast shows. And so this conversation and diving into the aspect around audience is something that Jo knows a thing or two about in terms of identifying, speaking to, and keeping the attention of her audience. Jo describes her superpowers as connection, curiosity, and having ideas. And so having you all join us while I pick Jo's brain around understanding what it's like in this current iteration or chapter of her work and life is going to be an interesting one, I think, as we explore that. Jo, I'm wondering if you can kick us off by really talking to us about why Broad Radio? Where did that come from?
Yes, it's a good question. One I'm asked often.
Do you ask yourself that?
Well, I mean, I would say that every single startup founder comes to one place in the development of their business where they go, why did I do this?
Yep.
If I had any idea how hard it was, maybe I would not have done so. But essentially it came from an opportunity and a need, and that intersection of looking around at what I felt was a real need for women over 40 in radio. And, some people would suggest that radio is a medium that is on the decline. Actually, about 90% of Australians still listen to radio regularly, but the delivery of it is shifting, obviously. Podcasts are on the rise very much, but this love for radio and the immediacy of it as a medium and the opportunity for it to reflect that day, that community, that feeling in the air, whether it's, the Grammys, or whether it's Taylor Swift visiting the city, or whether it's, sport that's happened, or even just a general feeling that you might have in your stage of life. Radio is my first love for that reason. It's transformative. And so I looked around and I saw a real need that women over 40 are very much neglected by radio. then I sort of looked around also about the fact that of the voices that we hear on radio, only 27% are female. That is mostly in commercial radio, but you know, in independent radio and the ABCs and SBSs out there, it's a similar kind of. Well, the ABC is better, but yeah, in commercial radio, 27% of the voices are female, and I was like, oh, that's really dangerous when you consider that radio does shape society so much, shapes behaviors and views and biases. So that need really became quite urgent for me as the more I thought about it. And then I saw the opportunity because, of course, for anything to work as a business, you need an audience, you need, you know, the commercial viability of it. And it was quite obvious to me, well, women control 80% of the household spending. Reportedly, women feel overlooked by marketers and advertisers, as well as, I think, the media. And I thought, well, this is something that I know inherently how to connect with audiences and audiences that are basically me. I mean, it's so easy.
Talking to yourself.
Yeah, that's it. I am the audience, right? So it became, yeah, it was about opportunity and need. And even though I had the idea, it was obviously a pretty big idea. And I was like, well, you know, I had spoken with the different networks and they were pretty interested in the concept, but didn't really want to. Well, we didn't get far down the road of the conversation before COVID hit. And then, you know, the world changed and their connection to revenue changed very much for them. But the great thing was technology changed super fast. And suddenly streaming became so common. This kind of conversation, Bessie, was, you think before COVID, we weren't doing this sort of thing, right? We were not streaming live. But suddenly we were all having gin and tonics with our best friends who were outside our 5K radius. And yeah, the technology caught up really quickly and it became obvious that I was maybe going to be able to do this in our own way. And yeah, so off we took on this adventure.
It's interesting too, because on that aspect around streaming and shifts in technology and the role that, say, something like COVID played in that, I think you're right, because there was also, even for those of us that were doing some elements online, part of what COVID did was shift how polished we thought things had to be to share them publicly.
So much.
Because when I think about, I had wanted to start my podcast for about 5 years before I did. And that was, I think, about 2 years ago now that I started. But part of why I'd never begun was that I had a vision in my mind of this beautifully curated, like face-to-face interviews in this gorgeous studio. Like I had a picture of what it needed to look like and what I would love for it to look like. And because that wasn't the option yet, I didn't do it. And then it was like, okay, this is just silly, just start, you know. And those pieces did change of what people got used to seeing of their colleagues, and even news anchors being, you know, setting up at home with their families, recording them. Like it just changed a whole bunch of stuff, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it reinforces a few things. One is that old adage, which is so true in the startup world, done is better than perfect, right? So just do it, right? Start. You just have to start. The other thing is that the democratization of content, which podcasting has really been the push, like that has shifted everything, because you can do exactly what we're doing right now. We're recording in our house. It's pretty good technology, but the content is the conversation and the ideas and the thoughts and the connection and the difference you make to the audience around feeling not alone or feeling understood. It doesn't matter what your microphone is, right? Now, I mean, I'm a purist about that sort of thing because I come from that world.
Of course.
But it really excites me for women's voices because you can find an audience in the podcast world. It doesn't matter how niche you are. There's an audience out there. And for women who are very much overlooked by mainstream media and non-binary folk, you can find an audience and you can say things that are really, really important. And podcasting has done that. Podcasting has changed the world as far as that's concerned. Broad radio is sort of borrowing, or, you know, it's a hybrid of that style of content and that style of conversation. But also we're bringing live radio to it as well. So we do podcasts, we do live radio, and the platform kind of straddles both.
And I'm wondering, so when you were explaining where it all sort of came from and what you explored, why not? Because my guess is if you had gone to some of the bigger stations and broadcasters pitching a show, you might have got a bite quicker and easier. Why not a podcast or a show on commercial radio? Why the platform? Because is it just that collection? Like you said, it's sort of this hybrid. It's bringing together multiple podcasts and multiple shows. Was it the desire to get some scale to it, or is there something else about it being its own thing that's important to you?
That's such a great question, and not one I'm often asked. So firstly, if one of my drivers is redressing gender imbalance in the media, doing one show is not going to do it. Creating a radio network that stands side by side, and albeit in a very different way. We're never, ever going to be another, Southern Cross Austereo or an ARN. That's not our intention. We don't want to be that. We're reinventing the delivery of radio in a much more lean and agile way. But we need to make a play in that, on that field, in that game, to actually make the point. And it's the same for a lot of people have asked, why not community radio? Why not be a not-for-profit? And there are so many different ways we could have done this, but it was definitely deliberate that we make a play in the place where you want to make the change. And I'm full of mottos and mantras and adages. I've got to say, Bessi, so there's another one for you.
I tattoo them on my body, so
yeah,
I think
me too. There's a whiteboard just over there full of them.
Perfect.
But you've got to start where you're going to finish, right? So even though at the moment what we're doing is really tiny, I see a 5-year vision. In my mind, we are actually already there. It's just at the moment we're at this point on the road. So I had to do it this way. It had to have live radio as well as podcast. I can tell you the amount of times I thought to myself when it's been really hard, and we've bootstrapped this, so we've put a lot into it. There have been times when I've said to myself, didn't I just do a podcast? But I tell you what, last year,
had a vision.
Well, we have a vision. I have a vision, but also last year when we launched, we got a huge amount of PR. Let's just take that as an example. Not just our growth, very rapid growth of audience, but even just the PR. There's no way we would have got that without the noise that we made because we were launching a radio network.
Yeah, there's sort of, it changes the conversation or the sense of, often people talk about that you're signaling something, which actually a good word to use when you're talking about radio, but it's that piece of the projection or the putting out, even if it's the bare bones of what it will eventually be, signals the direction you're headed.
Absolutely. And even, again, taking that PR for an example, we got, I think it was about 400 mentions or something. So it was a potential audience of 7 million people over the time of our launch campaign, right? Now, can you imagine if, let's say, 7 million people did come in contact with our message, which is that there are only 27% of the voices we hear are women, less if you're over 40, less if you're a First Nations woman, if you're a woman of color, women with disabilities, LGBTQI. If maybe half of those 7 million people heard that message, imagine that people don't know that. People don't know that this is the kind of mainstream media we're being served every day. And to me, I feel like, well, we've achieved already a massive part of our vision and our goals.
Yes, because it puts that spotlight and tunes people into something they were unconscious of before.
Exactly.
How would you describe those gaps that you saw or were unsatisfied in the current market, the current way that radio is operating, and how exactly are you trying to fill those gaps with what you're doing at Broad Radio?
Well, the way I would describe the gaps I hear I love radio and I listen to all different kinds of radio, more than I listen to podcasts. So because that's, I suppose, the background I come from. And I am aware that a lot of people don't listen to radio at all anymore. And I would argue that's because they haven't found the radio they like. But when I listen, for me, the gap is essentially, why does this not sound like the people that I go to school pick up with? Or why do I not hear people that are like the same people I stand next to at footy training or, catch the train with every day? Or, it just is so tiny a version of being an Australian. Now, I understand they have a commercial imperative and their strategy, their content strategy and their mission is very different to ours. But for me, that's where I feel we sit, that we step in and go, all right, well, let's find. And for me, when I started in radio, I remember the moment where the microphone went on for the first time, and I went, wow, this is a massive responsibility and opportunity, right? And I was really determined to make the best use of that I could. And then after I finished doing breakfast radio, I realized, well, why is it just me on mic? Everyone looks like me. Everyone's white cisgender. So my challenge is to turn my one mic into 100 mics and just put other people on there, other people who have different stories and different
the full reflection of that community. Yeah.
So that's what I aim to do. We are currently not 100 mics because we're very little, but down the track we will be.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, it's interesting because, so we said at the beginning that aspect of 20-year career, very successful in nailing that particular lane that you were in radio, but it is still different. Say that piece you described of being behind the mic, you're a host of the show. You could be a host of a show and not actually tune into or understand the broader business model of how that radio station is working or tune into some of those elements. How much did you find you thought you knew that when you've now started your own business and you're trying to build a very different business model in that industry, how much has been helpful and transferable and you're like, I do have those insights, it is working, I understand that gap in the market, and how much has been that shock to the system of like, oh, okay, this is very different to the view of it I got as that host behind the mic?
Well, I mean, you're right. You could very easily live in a bubble whereby you never think 1 minute about the business when you are on air. And for many years, I suppose I did. I mean, breakfast radio is weird too, because you arrive in the middle of the night and you'd leave kind of like, we would leave at 11 a.m. So, and that was late. A lot of people leave at 9:30, but you just sort of don't mix with the real world. So it's very easy to be in a bubble
Yeah.
and to just go, all I care about is putting the best show on air. And because that is your only job, really.
Yes.
But your job actually is also to super serve clients and brands and come up with creative brand integration ideas. That means that the radio station makes money. That's your job, right?
Yeah.
As well as connecting with the audience and being the number one show. So in that, I guess I became curious around the business. I became curious around how, and I'd come from sort of arts management. So I'd come from this notion that, yes, obviously there has to be a commercial imperative. There has to be the tension between creativity, audience, and making money. And so I sort of gradually became curious about it. And I suppose in the last couple of years that I did breakfast, I learned more and more. But I was still distant from it because you don't have to be. And breakfast radio
It's
is,
not your responsibility. Yeah.
well, you are just so overwhelmed. Like, it is
Mm.
brutal. And you really find yourself just in survival mode a lot of the time. But then when I finished,
Prepared you well for being a founder then.
exactly.
Brutal, overwhelmed. There's some good
Yeah.
words. Yeah.
No sleep, working at weird times of the day and night. But yeah, it was afterwards, I suppose, where I started looking around and really understanding the business model and what we would do differently or the same. What have I learned since then? I think I would say, well, the commercial side of it, the commercialization of content, I never really had to hold that responsibility. But now the buck stops with me, literally. Every buck. So I guess understanding the sales and that revenue piece in a more, visceral way has been pretty interesting, because I know that there are people within commercial networks that responsibility is very heavy on them, and I never really had to think about that. So that's been pretty profound.
Are there particular things that you've done to make sure you have that finger on the pulse related to audience as you're building broad radio? Certain, maybe that you've brought over from previous experience or that you've tried for the first time?
What I do is remain curious every day and every minute of that day around Many things. So firstly, what is my audience reading, watching, listening to? What do they love?
And how do you do that? Like, how do you find that out?
I just ingest every single thing you can possibly do. And I think that commercial breakfast radio teaches you that. Like, you just need to be connected to every single thing that's happening in the world, or otherwise.
So whatever comes up, you can be familiar with, like, oh, that person said this, or, so is
Yeah.
it that kind of just, it becomes natural?
Well, it's you're sort of not even really aware of it. You kind of are just absorbing the day. I'm very much a watcher, as in I don't watch TV.
Observe,
I
like,
observe, yeah.
yeah.
I observe, and I'm a writer. So if someone was to ask me what actually is it that you do, the first thing I would say is that I'm a writer, because writers sit and observe the world, find a way to kind of process it in their own sort of experience, and then blah, put it back out into the world, right? And I've done that in many different ways, and I see broad radio as exactly that. So firstly, I connect with the audience as often as I can all the time, and listen with curiosity, that active listening and being silent long enough to go, oh, that's interesting. That's a different experience to me. Why is that different? Or that's the same experience to me, but they're going through it in a different way. So all that kind of thing. But the other thing, again, Bessie, is exactly what you and I have been doing. Like, I just love, and it's been so great. Oh, I love it so much. Literally cold connections via sometimes introductions, but sometimes just emails or, LinkedIn or however it is, just going, wow, I really am interested in what you're doing. Tell me more about it. And let me tell you a bit about what we're doing. And what is the connection? How do we intersect? How do we shift the world in a really positive way together? That's been amazing.
And how do you then address that gap? So if you go back to the fact that you could be reading, listening to, observing all of the different things that are out there in the world. But if we come back to your point that if 27% of the voices are women, and even smaller percentage represent other communities, and there's a natural bias in what's being put out, how do you do that next step to identify, okay, someone who isn't coming at this from the same perspective as me, who either, you talked about in radio when it was, you looked around and you're like, oh, we're all white, cis, So how do you do that next piece that allows you to create the platform of Broad that has that diverse representation of voices without projecting onto people or speaking on their behalf with, like, what's that step and how do you do that practically?
That is a really, really astute observation, because the unfortunate thing is when you say, great, I just, I listen and read and watch and whatever, what I'm being served up is biased anyway, right?
Yes. Even if it's high quality, like well-intentioned, like even the best stuff has all of those things you've just spoken about of the bias, unintentional, unconscious, but still there.
Exactly right. From the very beginning, I have identified, well, it can't be me speaking. It can't be me creating the content. So when we launched last year, our team deliberately, so firstly, you've got to create the structures that allows for you to be different. And one of the things I chose to do was have a job share arrangement with our breakfast show. Now, that is never done in breakfast radio. Always the two people with the anchor, maybe sometimes three, it's usually two men and a guy. That's for a reason. Audiences like to become very familiar with that team as though you're best friends, right? And so you grow that familiarity, and that's how you rate really well. There is science to that. But for me, I was like, well, okay, that's going to lock me into, firstly, the same people every day. How am I going to get diverse voices when it's the same people every day? But also it locks out a bunch of people I want to work with, because they can't commit and they don't want to commit. They're either touring, they're doing TV shows, they're caring for their kids, whatever it is, right? So I just went, well, there's no reason why we can't run a job share arrangement in our shows. We're totally throwing all of the regular models out the window as far as what radio is. So I set up the structure whereby it was a job share arrangement. So we had a team of anchors, a team of co-hosts, we had some regular contributors, and of that, we just sort of mixed and matched. And that allowed, firstly, for me to work with people like Marie Hardy, who's super busy, Michaela Bannis, incredibly busy, Nellie Thomas, she's homeschooling and she's got kids with complex needs. People who would love to do radio but can't commit full time. But it also allows me to have a huge diversity of voices in there, whether it's Shelley Ware and Rana Hussain and, you know, Bryony Dawson and all these different people who you just wouldn't fit into a regular roster. So you've got to set up the structures, and then you find the people and you give them the microphone, and I shut up. It was that simple.
Love it. It's an interesting one because in doing that, so yes, there's all the willingness to take a risk, to do something different that may not work. But in the process, if you then get access to talent that you can put on the air, that is a differentiator. To come back to that aspect of when you launched, the response that you got and the curiosity that was there more broadly is like, oh, that's different. I haven't heard myself reflected back to me on the radio, or I haven't. So you can differentiate yourself because, as you said, you now can appeal to a certain type of talent, a perspective that not only wasn't being represented in commercial radio currently, but also didn't have a way to even get a foot in the door because it didn't match all those other elements of their life that you spoke about. So I like that.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, I think one of the things that has always been the principle for me, and when we did the Matt and Joe show, and also on Joe and Lemo, so that was, you know, critical, that it did not matter what the profile that we were told our audience was. We never ever spoke down to them. We never ever underestimated them, because it doesn't matter what experiences or what kind of world you come from. People have complex thoughts and ideas and rich life experiences, and they bring, so I tell you what, the greatest joy, Bessie, is when you have talk back and you talk to people and they tell you their lives and their stories. They're funny and moving and clever and inspirational, right? And so that was always really important to us. However, what that very, you know, similar kind of radio overlooks is that people out there are hungry for different stories. So when you say, oh, I'm hearing myself reflected back to me because there are diverse voices, absolutely. But you don't need to be reflected back to be interested. So one of my favorite show was we put on air was Friday afternoon, Layla Gurawiwi doing, it was called Yappa's Yarning, First Nation stories. And to me, it was just the most beautiful conversation. Yappa's is sister in Nyurungu. And so hearing Layla with her Yappas, sharing stories, playing music, it was so beautiful. And you would imagine that's quite a niche show, but it was, you know, very popular. People loved hearing that show because of curiosity and because stories are stories, right?
It kind of connects a real person or a real family's experience. When you start to hear those stories connect with someone, it makes something more real than just being a disconnected news story or something that you read. I had the privilege nearly 30 years ago now to be to do this program where I was a youth ambassador. So I was representing Australia, and there was 53 other countries in the mix, and we traveled all around the world. And one of the things that did was it took me from being someone who just grew up, you know, in a bit of a bubble here in Australia, to meaning that for my entire adult life, a news story would come on and it didn't matter what country it was in. I wouldn't just go, oh, that happened in Bosnia. I'd go, oh my goodness, I wonder if Boyana's okay. So I would connect. Every place had a person that suddenly made the world real in a different way. And I think that story you just told is the same thing. You don't have to be an Indigenous person, but suddenly when you now hear other stories, you'll go, oh, that connects back to what I heard here, or it just makes people real. And I think all of the elements that we're seeing, even currently with a lot of negative pushback around things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can only have hateful views about people if you don't know anyone in that category. As soon as you kind of have a relationship or know someone, it changes and softens things.
Yeah, and that's the power of storytelling and really the power of podcasts and radio, that you get an insight into someone's world. And when you hear two people telling stories to each other or sharing, you know, you feel a part of it. It's, you know, when you said earlier, I think backseat or it's kind of voyeurism, but
Yeah.
it's also not, it's not, because voyeurism means you're actually excluded. The best kind of radio and podcast is that you feel like you're a part of the
Feel
conversation.
part of it.
Yeah, and it's storytelling, immediately humanizes people.
I'm curious, how are you dealing with, say, for example, you mentioned before stations like ABC or SBS. How do you think about the idea of who you give a platform to? So, for example, there's often this tension of, are you only letting people who have the same political views as you? Like, what if someone is, on the total other spectrum of a topic that is either something in your core values at broad or whatever? The Who comes into that mix? So when we talk about different voices, how do you think about your responsibility in the creating of this platform for allowing mix of different opinions and voices, but navigating what is central to your values and your mission as an organization, and not actually making yourself a platform for hate or misinformation? How does that work?
Yes. Well, I mean, firstly, I would say because we've only broadcast small versions of live programming and we've got our podcasts, there's a lot of podcasts there, but not
Mm,
not a massive network yet. It's been pretty like a pretty small bandwidth, I guess, of that.
yeah.
And as we grow, my vision is that obviously that's going to become more and more of a challenge,
Yeah.
actually. What I would say is the number one thing is you put yourself in the position of your listener, of your
Mm,
audience. So, I mean, we have my one of our content strategy policies is we have zero tolerance for hate.
yeah.
So it doesn't matter what side of the fence you are,
Mm,
if it's inflammatory or if it is in any way going to be divisive in a way that actually makes people feel like they are less safe than
mm,
they should be, then there's no place for it. But so that is a policy that we will never compromise on. But the answer to how do you balance varying views is, what is your audience interested in? What is your audience actually uplifted by in their day? We're not a news service. At some point down the path, I do expect to be providing, like news headlines and that sort of thing, but we're never going to be an ABC or an SBS in
mm,
that regard.
mm,
So we're not. That's not an imperative for us, and we're not intending ever to be provocative, disruptive. Yes,
yeah.
but for me, there's a difference. Most definitely, there's a courage of your convictions that's really important. There's a standing by your opinions. There's a standing by what is it that actually is at the core of who we are, and that is we are a platform with intersectional feminist principles, and that's sort of the foundation of it. And that means at times you will say things that are perhaps controversial to some,
Mm, mm,
and we will stand by that. But at the same time, our mission is supporting women's health, happiness, and pursuit of fearlessness. They are the three pillars and
mm,
the three lenses, if you will, that we
yeah.
put it's a filter. You put all
Yeah.
of your content and decisions through that. And so,
Which is really helpful to have.
yeah, it's like you've got to have a blueprint. You absolutely have to have a blueprint. It's why you have a personal brand. It's why you have a brand for your
Hmm.
actual business. And for us, it's got to sit through health, happiness, pursuit of fearlessness, and what is your audience interested in and thinking that day.
And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we've talked about and centered some of this conversation around that idea of understanding your audience, having your finger on the pulse. But there's always this little dance of, where are those edges where someone doesn't necessarily know yet they need or would benefit from hearing this beautiful conversation between two Indigenous people. Like, so sometimes as an audience, when we haven't been exposed to things, we don't yet know that we would be interested in that it would tick all of those boxes. And so that is a real art form, I think, to kind of still be respectful and honoring those elements of alignment to what you have said you are going to be as an
Mm.
organization or a platform, but then testing out, where can we add a richness to this that an audience couldn't yet anticipate they needed.
Yeah, well, and that's, I mean, so Tracy Hutchison is our music director, who is an absolute icon and legend of
Yeah.
broadcasting. She's been in broadcasting for 40 years. And when she and I started speaking about the sound of the station and the music that we would play, very much we talked around, and this is an example, I suppose you could use this even as a metaphor for everything that you choose to do or not do in content. You want to have really comfortable, familiar music that makes people feel like, yes, I'm sitting in a beautiful, my favorite couch, and I'm remembering my favorite memories, and I'm feeling great, right?
Yeah.
But there is a place for music that's perhaps new, that is perhaps like, slightly, like just slightly outside your comfort zone. There is a place for introducing things and experiences and ideas and thoughts to people in a sometimes maybe challenging way. Most definitely, great content is challenging sometimes. But it's about the mix of those two things, and it's about establishing trust with your audience so that they know, yep, I know. Most of the time I feel great and comfortable, and I feel like you get me. And because I know that,
I can trust them.
I can trust that you're going to take me down a path where I'm like, oh, haven't heard this before. Oh, this is interesting. And every now and then you don't get it right. And you go, oh, that was a little bit too far outside. That was, whoa, where'd that come from? Okay, that was, but you've got to just constantly ask your audience. You just have to ask. You have to constantly be curious as always and listen and go, oh, how did that sound? And if you didn't like it, you sort of go, okay, why? Because sometimes the not liking is what you're after.
Yes. And it's the encouragement that something is still going to feel foreign after the first time, but like, how much exposure do we need before we can go, oh, now I can make an actual decision on whether this is for me or not?
Yeah, curiosity, I've said a few times, it's really important that you listen to your audience, because you can't make assumptions. Like I laugh about the fact that, well, I am the audience, and I am, but I also am one tiny version of the audience.
Well, and in some ways, you are the audience, but you're a part of the audience that already has some safety, some access to power and privilege, and the pieces that mean you can take a risk that not everyone else in your audience can. And I think that's one of the pieces I am often saying to people when they're a little bit cocky about, trying to tell other people to be brave. And I'm like, you can do that in your position. And so great, yes, encourage people to be brave, but not everyone has the same, pieces stacked in their favor. And so I think it's actually great that as a part of that community you're representing, you are taking that risk and stepping into it and creating the space. And then, as you said, shutting up and letting others talk. But that's a really important role for you to take. And I think it is worth the honesty and acknowledgement to say not everyone can do that.
Absolutely. I not only do I acknowledge my privilege as far as, yes, I was able to take the risk to start a business, and I have very fortunately created 20 years worth of network so that I have huge supports around me. Even outside of that, if I emailed someone and asked for a meeting, generally I would get that meeting, which has been really critical to the growth of our business. And I fully acknowledge that privilege. And I've also reflected upon, that's why the idea came to me, because it was actually my responsibility. I don't see broad radio doesn't belong to me. I believe, it was sort of the universe gifted me the idea. I have this extraordinary privilege in building it. But the whole thing belongs to the women and non-binary folk, and men also. A lot of men loved it. But to the people who want this kind of conversation, it belongs to them. But it was gifted to me because I was the person who could do it. And I consider that a huge privilege.
What are the things that, looking back at the current models of how radio, media, all of those things are working, what are the things that you would say you think are broken and can't be fixed? And what are the things that you think are the predictions you would make of what is actually needed in this moment for all of these pieces we've been talking about to kind of come together and be successful for that 5-year and beyond vision that you have for broad radio?
And so it's evident that there's something broken, perhaps, around their revenue model. What I would not take from them, I guess, is the need to be extraordinarily large.
Yeah.
I think that's perhaps connected to the revenue model that's not working for them anymore.
Yes. Yep. And the ability to shift and be agile, it changes when you are trying to move this beast.
That's right. I mean, they can't put the genie back in the bottle. They've been around for 30, 40 years. So I mean, I understand where they're at in
Yeah.
the industry, and they've built the industry off the back of those models. But the world is changing because we do have single operators attracting millions of audiences, millions, look at Joe Rogan. The world is changing so much. And so I would not take from them the need to be huge to have impact. For me, large audiences, very, very good and very, very appealing, particularly for your commercial commercialization. But engaged audiences to me are way more valuable, way more interesting to me. And I think you can have a lot more impact that way. So that's, I guess, how we are building ourselves to that 5-year vision. And make no mistake, that vision 5 years from now is millions of people listening, scaling globally, being a very large organization. But it's getting there in very small incremental steps, where you are really building off the back of engagement. We are literally building off the back of community. Like, community is how we got to where we are. We did an equity crowd fundraise last year, raised 385,000, which got us to where we are now, all off the back of community who really can see exactly what we're aiming to do and want it to happen and want to be a part of it. And since we've launched our live and our app, please download the app.
We'll put a link to that.
But since we started that, all of the growth has come from people loving the notion. Because let's face it, actually the business is a long way off being what the business is intended to be. But the notion is enough for our community to say, yes, I want to be a part of it. I want it to happen. And so to me, engagement is a bit of a catchword, really. But it's about community is the thing that has spurred me on, and it is the thing that connects people to each other and makes me know that we are actually creating something that's of value and is going to be the thing that helps that individual woman who may be in regional rural Australia feel a little bit maybe healthy, happy, pursuit of fearlessness. That's all that matters really to me.
And it's the getting that feedback, and as you said at the beginning, the piece of going into startup land and just putting something out there, not waiting for it to be perfect and done. That feedback from those listeners is essential too, because I'm sure that you, like every other founder and business owner, has found that there are things that you assumed were like an essential element for someone to engage that it turns out is not necessary, and then other things that you thought wouldn't be important that are. Like, we learn, if we try to design something in isolation and wait till it's perfect, we're always going to be wrong. Through jumping in last year and beginning, are there some of those elements for you where you've been surprised at what is required and what's getting traction?
Yeah, I mean, like, we are so early in our iteration that every single thing we're doing is still a first. So we most definitely learned a great deal last year. We broadcast Monday to Friday for 10 weeks last year. And that was incredible. Since then, we've really, that for many reasons, we've reduced our operations, and now we're doing episodic. We have a beautiful series.
Oh, yes. Tell us about the one coming up.
Oh, well, it's embargoed at the moment.
Okay. So don't tell us about that, Jo.
Oh my God, it's killing me as a marketer. And I'm like, oh, I can't really say.
But basically, watch this space, folks. There's exciting things coming.
There is an exciting show coming. We will be announcing it later this week. But it's a different sort of creating live because it just, taking the steps that you need to take running, walking before you run, I suppose, would be a good way of describing it. And that came from the learnings that we had from doing the 10 weeks last year. But like I say, that was the first time we've done that. This is the first time we're doing this. And I feel like in a year's time, I'll be able to answer this question better, because doing something once probably isn't enough.
Doesn't give the patterns and data
yet. It doesn't. So I have to keep reminding myself that, because I am in this 5 years from now vision. That's what I feel, what I'm walking that person's life every day, even though I'm still doing things for the first time. Like we're such babies, Bessi.
And that is, I mean, it takes a level of patience and discipline to force yourself to stay in what's required now when you have a really clear vision that is years or decades down the track. Like holding those two spaces is tricky. I know it well, so I feel for you.
I am an extremely impatient person, it's true. But then, I also believe...
But strategic. I think if you're impatient but strategic, then you can walk that one.
I'm very, very strategic, and also I am also very woo-woo. So I do believe that
timing is important.
Yeah, I believe that time unfolds as it needs to. And I do believe also in the perfect sequence of events that have led to this moment. So if I was to skip ahead 5 years, I would miss 5 years of perfect sequence of events.
Absolutely.
Why would I do that?
Yeah. And you would also lose all of those pieces that, looking back, you'll be like, that conversation opened that door, opened that, in the same way that your 20 years has meant you can pick up the phone and get a meeting with someone that you couldn't have got if you had 20 years ago said, I'm going to start my own thing. Like, it wouldn't have happened.
Let me tell you, it blows my mind on a daily basis when you just go, oh my gosh, this would not be happening if that one little conversation hadn't happened 6 years ago. Or like it is, to me, a miracle of life.
Yeah. I love that. As we wrap up, Jo, because the time has flown by, are there any particular things you wanted to share with us that we haven't covered? And if not, where is the best place for people to go to find out more and to connect with you?
Most definitely. Well, what would I share? I should have prepared something there. What's my call to action?
We'll definitely share the link, so people should get the app.
Yes, download the app to listen to our music, and when we go back to our new live show, which is coming, you'll need to have the app to listen to that.
But there's already lots of content there. And
absolutely, yes. We have 30 plus podcasts they're women-led podcasts from many, many different kind of content creators, as well as our own, and amazing music that you can listen to across the day and the evening. So yeah, lots of content there already on the app. And you can listen to our podcasts outside of the app as well, of course. I would say if this sounds like something you're really passionate about, you could become a broad member. So it's $8 a month or $80 a year to support diverse women's voices and independent media. But we've done our research, Bessi, and the people that have become members, it seems the key driver is really wanting to elevate women and diverse voices. So
beautiful.
We have
this is a great way of practical.
We have giveaways as well. But if it's more about knowing that you're making a difference in the world, that's another reason to join us.
Yeah. Well, and your members are probably going to, at this point of the journey, be those people who are the exact mix we just spoke about of they're going to have a long-term vision of like, I want to be part of this, but understand building and growing anything takes time.
Yeah. Look, and I have been so grateful for people see the vision, which it's pretty beautiful, I've got to tell you. It's really beautiful, Bessi. I just feel so enveloped in love.
That's a beautiful thing. I'm very glad that you do, and hopefully that can sustain you through these next few years as it all builds out. Thank you so much, Jo, for joining us and for sharing some of that experience with us.
Oh, thank you for your generosity. I've loved it. Really loved it.
My pleasure. And hopefully people can jump on those links, download the app, become a member, and don't forget to keep an eye out for all the exciting things that are going to be happening over the coming months.
There is a new show coming, yes.
Very exciting. Awesome. Thank you, Jo.
Thanks, Bessi.